What I wanted to talk about today, and I can actually make sure I become more specific, I do SSI, SSD claims, including overpayments and cessations. I also provide representation for Section 8 administrative hearings, evictions, landlord-tenant issues that can be disputed outside of court and negotiated, as well as any other fair hearings, including anything from CPS to really you name it, and we try to get there, we make an effort. So our focus in the legal services and advocacy is to just help improve and sustain our folks in the community, whether it's through housing or income. To really recap what Carl has said, and I really appreciate everything that you've said, and everything that I'm going to say is going to sound very familiar, except I'm going to really hammer it into your head, so I apologize, but at the same time I don't. Because we're going to make this more interactive. We can talk about these issues a little bit more, but everything bears repeating, because we all think we know mental health. We all think we understand someone who's affected by a mental health diagnosis or symptoms, but we don't know how to interact with them, because we think we understand, but it's an assumption that can be very dangerous. What I wanted to do today is make sure that we're, first of all, going beyond any kind of label. As Carl has mentioned, no one here, unless you are, is a clinician, and we're not even going to assume that we are. Just because you understand what depression is, maybe you do yourself, does not mean you understand what depression is in someone else. It just isn't the case. And we're not here to diagnose anybody. We want to make sure that if there is a symptom going on, if there is a condition going on, that they are getting the respect that they need, they're getting the help that they need at the place that they're in. Today what I wanted to do was really, it's going to sound very broad, and I'm not going to go in specifics of how do you work with the client who has schizophrenia. It's not going to be like that, because I want to make sure we're avoiding those labels. And frankly, you might be approached by clients that don't have any diagnosis. They haven't been treated by any professional psychologist, psychiatrist, or otherwise. And so they might be exhibiting symptoms, but they themselves don't know what's going on. So it's just important for us to pick up on little cues that are here and there, and that we can try to make sure that we can make that into a functional conversation for the client. As it is in the handout, and as Carl had stated, we look at mental health as a spectrum. So there's wellness and there's illness. And so when we're talking about this, again, the diagnosis isn't important, because anyone can be affected by a mental illness at any time in their lives. Unfortunately, some people have it more pervasive and more severe. And unfortunately, some people will never get out of that dark cloud. But we want to make sure that, any client that you're seeing, whether they have a diagnosis or not, this should be applicable to them. So that's my goal, at least, to make this something where it's not only helping people that have mental health diagnoses, but helping those in general that might be just going through a crisis. Stress makes us do really weird things. It typically makes us do things that aren't normal for our daily behavior. They make us do things that aren't rational. And a stressful situation can be, my husband just left me and now I have no money to take care of my children. A stressful situation may be, I just got a knock on my door and they have a warrant saying I need to leave the home. There's a lot of things that could be happening where a person who is even well can all of a sudden crumble. So we want to make sure, again, this is just applicable, but recognizing that I think everyone in here understands, our clients are coming in with serious situations, but recognizing that they might be coming in a state where they're not going to understand what you're saying. And when you're talking in legalese or in talking in ways that are very technical, and where we think it's just go A, B, C, it's going to be A, Z, D, F, and they're just not going to understand. And it has nothing to do with their intellect, it has nothing to do with any other type of impairment, it's just that their level of comprehension may be that impaired, okay? So in addition to, talking about that, I would I would be very neglectful to not talk about what mental health and mental hygiene is like in New York State. Believe it or not, it's one of the better states to be in if you have a mental health diagnosis. In my work at the Mental Hygiene Legal Services, that specializes in helping provide legal representation for folks who are inpatient or outpatient in the New York State system, the hospital systems, and making sure that they understand what can be done for their administration of medications and discharge and things like that. When I was working with them, I began to understand that we actually have more rights in this state if you have a mental health diagnosis. Doesn't mean we have a perfect system. It's not even close to a perfect system. But if you are someone that's affected by mental health, you have rights. I constantly get phone calls from family members that say, I need to put my son in the hospital. And I have to explain to them, well, if your son isn't a risk to himself or others, there really isn't any need for him to be in the hospital right now, and here are some additional supports for him. Because again, we get really excited in thinking that, well, my child's in crisis, this is what needs to be done, but your child still has rights, especially if they're over 18. There is some information regarding, very briefly, about what we have under the mental hygiene law and under Rivers, which is allowing a patient to refuse medication. There is a process. Eventually, sometimes the hospitals do win, but at least that person has due process and has a say in their treatment. But if you want more information, especially regarding Kendra's Law, which may affect your clients more directly, has anyone ever heard of Kendra's Law before? I see some nods. It's an interesting law that's been copied in other states. Unfortunately, it was due to a very tragic death of a woman who was named Kendra, who was pushed in front of a New York City subway. And the reason why that's important is because the person who pushed her mistaken her as his girlfriend, and he unfortunately was in a psychotic break. So they tied his mental health with her death, and now we have Kendra's Law that is meant to help provide more assistance for folks who are possibly going to be going through those breaks or become a risk to themselves or others, and they have a little bit more supervision. Again, it's not a perfect system, but it has helped many people actually to stay compliant. It helps them to make sure they know where they can get their medications, who's there to help them go through the system, and it is far more intensive, and that's actually usually through a court order. But if you want more information on Kendra's Law, the law itself is posted at the end of that sheet, but that's something that you can look up, and it's good to know because it might be affecting some of your clients who are out in the community. So the thing that I'd like to do today, and I hope we have enough time to do it well enough, is to go through a bunch of hypotheticals. When I was approached by Gail and Shelby in my previous work with Rachel, it was brought to my attention that you're aware of what it's like to work with clients. I'm not trying to reteach anything here, but when it comes to working with clients that may have some difficulties understanding the process or things like that, there's some instances that we could work on, and I hope the hypotheticals can kind of pinpoint those areas and what you can do in the situation. If you want to learn more about specific de-escalation skills and genuine listening skills that we're going to talk about, absolutely talk to Carl and speak to him regarding the mental health first aid classes. I am myself a graduate of it, and even though I had significant background in psychology and in social work before I took this course, I found it extremely useful. And it's something that I really encourage everyone to do, not just practitioners, but I think specifically in our profession, it's something that it's only 8 hours, and trust me, it will be worth it, especially if it's something where it might be life or death, considering the risk for that client. So when we go through these hypotheticals, we'll make it as interactive as you'd like it to be, but I just want to make sure that if there's any particular issue that you wanted to talk about or wanted to add to that hypothetical, please refrain. Let's try to keep it to that hypothetical specifically, just so we can make sure we can stay on task and get through all the different hypotheticals, but also I want you to talk about it, but possibly in the Q&A section in case we didn't get to it. Because that way, if there's a situation that you have gone through and someone may have gone through themselves, we can start discussing that as well. But I just want to make sure that we stay on task with these hypotheticals. So the first hypothetical that I have listed on the second page of the handout is regarding a client who comes into the office stating that she's interested in talking to someone about a divorce. So she's having issues at home, she's having issues with her partner, and she's extremely distraught. She's very emotionally on edge, and she's also disorganized to the point where she's inconsistent. You don't know where she's going. At one point, they were married 5 years ago. Now it sounds like they've been together for 10 or 15, and it gets more and more confusing as she's becoming more upset. And so let's discuss how would you get this client back on track? Anyone just want to throw it out there?
Ask specific questions.
Okay, and what kind of specific questions would you ask?
Like, how long were you married?
Okay.
What assets you have?
Okay. And now that's a very technical and a very good question when it comes to the legal work. And so that's one of those things where it's absolutely not wrong, but let's think about, you have someone who is completely distraught now, and she is going to get kind of jarred by a question like that, because she's going to say, I don't know what you mean by assets. What's an asset? She might know, but she might not be able to say it off the top of her head.
I always start in a very even-keeled voice and tell my clients, like, everything's going to be okay. We're going to get you the help you need, and if you can't get the help here, we're going to connect you with someone else. And then when their narratives are kind of scattered, either I recap them for them and then ask them to say yes or no, or like make like literally a list and be like, 1, remember when you told me this is the year, and then we write that down. And I think it's important to go slowly and to use a very calming voice and to not get frustrated when they're frustrated.
Okay.
Just hasn't been helpful for me in the past.
And everything that you said was excellent, and it's actually going to bridge into some of our other hypotheticals. We'll see who's paying attention. But if everyone could hear, there's a few things that I wanted to take out of, I'm sorry, your name?
Talia?
Talia's answer. So Talia speaks in a very subdued voice. So she doesn't try to raise your voice over the client. And what I really appreciated what you said was that she makes a list of everything that's going on in that client's life so that she can come back to it. And it kind of goes into what I would have as the to-do for this type of situation. One thing is you want to give genuine listening skills. And this sounds like I know what it is to listen, but it's actually a very difficult practice that takes a lot of time and discipline to really be able to master. But basically what it means is anyone can hear what's going on, and you might be able to take some key words down. But when you're actually in front of somebody and they're exploding in front of you, it's really good, and if you can, put the pen down actually. Because if you can listen, just give them 5 minutes. I give a 5-minute rule to all my clients. Give them 5 minutes, just let them have it out. Because you're going to get some nuggets in there that are relevant to the case, but at the same time, she's going to be heard. So you want to make sure that you're listening to what the client is going through. You might be the 5th attorney that she's seen. You might be the 5th attorney she's seen that day. So she might have already been through the ropes to get to a solution for this situation. So it's one of those things where it's important that you're there to listen, hear what she's going through, and then she'll be able to naturally calm down because now you've engaged a trustful relationship. Another thing, and this is not to critique you or anything like that, but we all have the tendency to want to be a helper. All of us here are in the public sector because we want to be helpers. What that can do, though, is we want to be overly empathetic in saying it's going to be okay. And I love that expression because it's very warming and it's very tender. But at the same time, when somebody is going through crisis and you say it's going to be okay, it can go into very different extremes where either they feel as though you're patronizing them, believe it or not, or you are you're setting them up for too much hope, because we can't guarantee anything. So just like we learned through law school, you can't guarantee a win for a case. We have to be careful that when we're working with someone who's going through crisis, because there's so much that's going on in their life, that we don't say those words. We want to make sure that we can say, and don't ever say I understand either. That's another big one that you don't say. But you just want to say, this sounds very difficult. Kind of approach it in the sense that they know that you're listening to them, but it allows them to also feel like you're not trying to impose yourself on their life either. Don't try to project. So basically, in essence, become a genuine listener. Have a different poise with that client. Make sure that body language can mean everything. A lot of people, when you're going like this, I love to sit like this because I'm always cold. But it's also, just a relaxing state for me. But for some clients, it can seem, especially if you're leaning back or if you're, like this, you're disinterested. So, you want to make sure you're engaged with them, good eye focus, good posture, and if you do tend to lean like this, make sure it's something still engaging, that you're still, approaching them in a way that you're not closing yourself out from that client. And other things is, if you need to write it down, I have a terrible memory, so I do write down as well, and I love lists. So, what I'll often do too is I'll say, I'm listening to you, and I appreciate you telling me your story, but I want to make sure that I get this right. So just so they understand, like you're almost getting permission from them, so they don't think you're ignoring them. And this was actually my own personal experience. I went to an attorney regarding a civil matter, and he sat with, his pen like this. He's like, never made eye contact with me, writing everything down. And then he's like, yeah, we can't really do much more than writing this letter for you. And maybe that's all that could have been done. But in the meantime, I'm thinking, you have no idea what I just told you. You have no idea what I just explained to you. And now I don't feel like I can trust you. Did I stay with that attorney? No. And I mean, you have clients who really don't have a choice here, but it doesn't mean that we can't treat them with that kind of respect. So moving on to the second hypothetical. So the second hypothetical is, let's see, we have a repeat client, and this client's it's just very loud. Their voice demands attention. They're extremely tangential, which is a fun mental health word that just means they're all over the place. And they're also very defensive. So they're verbally defensive in the sense that they are, any time someone says, how are you doing today? What do you mean how I'm doing today? Like they're extremely uppity when it comes to responding to people. And because of that, everyone's having a difficult time understanding that person and what their situation is. And it sounds like something's really going on. There's some meat to this. But how do we make sure that we can get to that person to understand what's going on without, losing our patience with them? So how could you condense all the info that this person is giving you? They're possibly berating you and being loud at the same time. But how do you condense all this tangential and difficult information while still validating that person's position? Like, how do you think you would handle this situation? So we still have a client who is essentially in crisis, but they're a little bit more agitated in the sense that's a little standoffish. How would you still validate them and be able to get through the muddle? Basically, we're still taking the same listening skills. We're still using the genuine listening, making sure we're engaged with the client. And eye contact is actually a really interesting thing depending on the culture and depending on the person's comfortability. You don't want to give too much eye contact because they might not take that well. They might take that as something that they have to be worried about, or it's offensive, or play it by ear, but it never hurts to initially make that contact, and if they're quick to be listless, just don't worry about it, but just make sure you're still engaged. Now, when it comes to this type of listening skill, though, you have someone that's extremely defensive, extremely on edge, and they're kind of all over the place. So another thing Natalia had mentioned was kind of reframing what's going on in their life. So you're taking down those nuggets, and now you're saying, you know, Joe, you mentioned that there was something else. There was a letter in the mail, and you said it was from, you know, these people. Can you tell me more about that? And you might get into more tangential information, but what I like to do is then I bring it down to a process. So in working with folks who are going through mental health, the fastest thing that a person is able to engage in is emotions. And that's really reactive, and it's very spontaneous, and it feels guttural, and it feels good, and at the same time it's expressing themselves, but it's not solutions. It's not actually bringing them to a point that can make them comprehend what's going on. So what I like to do is I try to bring things back down to what I call processing, which is more it's not tangential, it's tangible. So instead of, you know, he's talking about creditors, and they're going to take us home, and they're going to do all these things that are making him more and more and more emotional. We get back to the very beginning, and we say, when did you buy that house? So then we ask those questions that are a little bit more process-oriented, because dates are things, right? That's not an emotion. Where do you live? That's a thing. That's not an emotion. And all these things can come back to ground that person, so eventually you can get to the meat. And it could take time. I'm not saying that that's an easy fix, but and some folks, unfortunately, you just can't do any of that. They're just so stressed out. But it's also important to remember in this situation that when a person becomes aggressive, it's not necessarily because of something you did. It's not necessarily because they are violent people or anything like that, but it has a lot to do with the fact that they are stressed and they don't know how to express it. And that's another reason why going back to something that's like, you know, as hard as this podium can help somebody, you know, feel more grounded, get a little bit more calm, and then, you know, instead of worrying about the stress, worrying about the task at hand and keeping it solution focused. And at the same time, it's really important that while we're going through all these listening skills, making sure we're trying to get to the solution, don't forget their emotional state. So validating their emotional state can be as simple as just saying, this sounds like it's extremely difficult for you. I can understand why you were having difficulties with the creditor's office. Do something that is still tangible, but also reflective of their stress or their emotion, because it's real. It's their reality. And that's another thing that just because we don't understand it doesn't mean that it's not true for them. So just bringing them back to something you know, more reasonable where you can actually help them, but being cognizant that they're still in that shaken state of mind, and you just want to make sure you can bring them down. Did anyone want to add to that one at all?
I think explaining why you're asking a question helps a lot. Particularly, I mean, if somebody's loud, they're loud, but a lot of times, as you said, they're defensive.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we just had an inmate in one of our consumer sessions, and a law student was asking about his mother being served. And the guy kind of came off the chair about, you know, his mother not lying, right?
Right.
So we just had to explain, you know, we're just being clarified, and these are the questions we're going to get asked.
Excellent.
You know, it's not going to work for everybody, but maybe, you know, each situation is different, but I think sometimes it's that.
I think that's an excellent point. So if everyone, I don't know if everyone could hear, but Joe was mentioning that, you know, explaining why the question was asked and giving, you know, again, but that's validating that person and making sure that they know that they were heard, but also that you need to be heard as well. And, you know, in my work, especially with Social Security law, I have to ask really personal questions, and people become extremely defensive. And anything in financial, as anyone knows that's volunteered with Claro, yeah, it gets really emotional because it is numbers, but it has something to do with their self-worth and whatnot. So explaining, if I don't ask it, it's going to be asked by the judge anyways. It's good that we can get it out here and we can understand it a little bit more before we go into court. Or trying to explain and put it into context, just so they don't think that you're meddling into their business. Another side note, the population that, the mental health population in particular, they're very vulnerable in a special way. Many of them have been railroaded in the financial aspect, in romantic aspects, in other relationships, and so their social capital is kind of depleted. And when they're speaking with a professional, some of them will be far too engaging and far too trusting, which can be dangerous because they're going to assume that you're Superman. And we don't have our capes. We are pretty awesome, but we can't do everything. And the other sense is that they don't want to be thought of as stupid. Because they're like, we've been through this road before, you're not taking advantage of me again. Even though you might not have any intention of that whatsoever. But yeah, they don't. Opening that door is a very special door, and it's something that should be respected. And if you have someone that's going through a crisis in particular, don't be a voyeur. Don't be asking the questions to seem nosy. Make sure that they understand where you're going with it. So very good point. So moving along, the next hypothetical is in regards to overcoming some cultural barriers.